The snow came early that year, a thick, relentless blanket that smothered the rolling hills of northern Vermont before most people had even gotten used to the cold. It piled against fences, hunched under the skeletal arms of leafless maples, and streaked across the fields in sharp, white gusts. On a quiet dirt road, several miles from the nearest town, a lone figure trudged through knee-deep drifts toward a peculiar structure that stood out like a jewel in a crown of frost. An octagon-shaped cabin, its walls golden brown and gleaming faintly beneath a dusting of ice. Caleb Morris, 52, gritted his teeth against the bite of the wind, the brim of his wool cap pulled low over his forehead. A rugged man, his skin tanned and creased from decades of sun and frost, he carried a bundle of kindling under one arm. His boots, scuffed and dusted with snow, left deep impressions in the crisp drifts. Most people in the valley had never seen a cabin like his, and many didn't understand why he bothered to build it the way he did. "You're insane, Cal," muttered a voice from behind him. It was Jerry Whitman, a neighbor who had grown up in the same hollow, his pickup truck idling against the shoulder of the road, the exhaust steaming like a dragon's breath. He shook his head, his scarf pulled tight, eyes narrowing against the snow. "Octagon? Who builds an octagon? And you're telling me this thing keeps warm on half the wood we burn?" Caleb smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted at secrets he had no intention of revealing. "It does," he said, voice low but steady. "You'll see soon enough." Jerry snorted, kicking at the frozen crust of the road. "I've lived here all my life. I know snow, I know cold. Nobody outsmarts winter, not by stacking angles or spinning cabins. You're just asking for frostbite and heartache." Caleb didn't answer. He stepped toward the cabin, the air around him sharp and silent except for the whisper of the wind through the trees. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine, cedar, and the faint tang of wood smoke. The walls converged at precise angles, each side of the octagon perfectly proportioned, forming a space that seemed both intimate and expansive. There were no wasted corners, no dark, unused nooks. Even the loft above, reached by a narrow wooden ladder, was optimized for heat retention. He dropped the kindling near the stone fireplace at the cabin's center. It was a sturdy, hand-hewn construction, surrounded by river rocks carefully chosen for their heat-retaining qualities. Caleb knelt, striking flint against steel to coax a spark, then fed the twine and shavings bundle until flames leapt eagerly. The warmth spread almost immediately, a gentle wave that kissed the walls and floor. "You really think that little fire will keep the whole place warm?" Jerry asked, stepping inside despite the cold, his boots leaving wet streaks across the wooden floor. He rubbed his hands together, skeptical, scanning the cabin's interior. Every beam, every plank, every joint was deliberate. Even the windows, small and double-paned with tight-fitting shutters, seemed to be part of some hidden geometry designed for maximum efficiency. Caleb's hands moved with the practiced ease of decades spent understanding fire, wood, and the stubborn ways of northern winters. "Half the wood you're burning in your square boxes would do the same in here," he said. "Angles make a difference. Air circulates differently. Heat doesn't get trapped in corners. It flows. It stays where you need it." Jerry shook his head, muttering curses under his breath. "You're lucky if this octagon keeps a draft out, let alone the cold. But go ahead, show me." He plopped onto a rough-hewn chair, arms crossed, eyes skeptical, waiting for the inevitable failure. Caleb climbed to the loft, where a small stack of firewood sat ready. He added a few pieces to the fire, then returned to the floor. Already, the heat moved with surprising evenness, reaching the walls in a way that felt almost unnatural for a structure of this size. Jerry's lips parted in disbelief. It's actually warm," he said, voice quieter now. "Like evenly warm, not just in front of the fire." Caleb nodded, satisfied but not smug. "It's the shape," he explained simply. "The octagon gives us 8 walls for airflow to circulate around the fire, 8 angles that push the heat evenly. Less wasted space, less cold spots. Every piece of wood works harder here than it does in a conventional square cabin." The wind rattled against the windows, sending a sharp, icy pulse through the walls. In most cabins, the sound alone would have been a warning, a herald of creeping frost. But in Caleb's octagon, the temperature barely dipped, the heat refusing to retreat, holding firm against the storm outside. Jerry rubbed his chin, stepping closer to the hearth. "So, you're telling me all those years we've been burning ourselves out, we could have done this? just reshape the house. Cal. B's eyes met Jerry's, steady and unwavering. It's not just shape, he said. It's understanding heat, understanding how cold works, and most importantly, it's about refusing to waste effort where it doesn't matter. Square walls, corners, wasted angles, they're traps for cold. Here, every inch has purpose. Every joint, every beam, every plank contributes to keeping warm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling tree branches and whipping snow into tight drifts that skidded across the frozen ground. Most people would have been huddled inside, swearing at the cold and wondering how their fire could ever fight back. Caleb and Jerry stood in the cabin's center, the Octagon cocooning them in warmth, a buffer against the fury outside. "I'll give you this, Cal," Jerry said finally, a note of awe creeping into his voice. "It's impressive, but don't think I'm gonna start building Octagons tomorrow. That's madness." Caleb laughed softly, the sound mingling with the crackle of the fire. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes a little madness is the only way to survive a winter like this." He stepped to the window, peering out at the snow-covered valley. The horizon was a blur of white and gray, broken only by the dark line of the forest where the wind roared through bare branches. The cabin, small and odd-shaped though it was, felt like a fortress against the storm. He could almost hear the cold protesting against the walls, whispering through the wood, only to be denied at every turn. Jerry followed his gaze. "I don't know how you do it, Cal," he said quietly. "Most of us, we just stack wood, light a fire, and hope. You think about it differently. You outsmart it." Caleb smiled faintly, brushing a hand over the smooth, varnished surface of the wall. "It's not magic," he said. "It's observation, experimentation, and maybe a little stubbornness." The two men fell silent, listening to the wind screaming across the fields, the snow piling higher with each passing hour. Inside, the Octagon held firm, heat circulating evenly, defying every expectation. Outside, neighbors would look at the odd-shaped cabin and shake their heads, calling it foolish, eccentric, even impossible. But inside, Caleb Morris knew the truth. The design worked. It held warmth where it mattered, used half the wood, and laughed at the winter that had tried to defeat him year after year. For now, that was enough. As night fell, the first stars pricked the sky with cold fire. The cabin glowed from within, a soft amber against the white landscape. Caleb added one last log to the fire, watching as the flames danced across the stones. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of mastery over the frost, the wind, and the snow. In the Octagon, heat had a home, and in that warmth, a man had found victory. The next morning, the sun struggled to break through a low, gray sky, casting a pale, muted light across the valley. Frost hung heavy on every branch, every fence post, every blade of grass poking through the snow. Caleb woke early, as he always did, the habit of decades spent battling cold ingrained in his bones. He pulled on his thick wool sweater and boots, then padded down the loft ladder to the main floor, where the fire from the night before still glowed warmly in the hearth. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the chill of the room, and for a moment simply stood by the window, watching the valley below. The neighboring cabins were smoke-free, their chimneys dark against the sky. Most would be lighting fires soon, burning twice as much wood to coax the same warmth that Caleb's Octagon delivered with half the effort. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, drawing Caleb's gaze. It was Jerry, bundled in layers, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, walking across the drifts toward the cabin. His scarf flapped in the wind like a small flag of defiance, and his eyes were wide, a mixture of awe and disbelief written plainly across his face. "You've got neighbors gathering," Jerry said as he stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. I haven't seen anything like it. People are curious. They're talking about it down by the main road. Half the valley wants to know how the hell an Octagon cabin keeps warm with half the wood." Caleb smiled faintly, taking a sip of coffee. "Let them watch," he said. "Let them see it for themselves. If they want to understand, they'll come around. If they just want to mock, well, they won't be cold inside, that's for sure." Jerry shook his head, still skeptical. "I can't believe you're so calm about it. Most people would be smug by now, rub it in everyone's faces." Caleb set his cup down and walked to the center of the cabin, letting his hands trace the polished beams. "Calm," he said softly. "No, I'm nervous as hell. This winter is brutal. We've had storms in the past that lasted weeks. Even this design isn't magic. It's just a way to fight smarter, not harder, that's all. They mow. Vet outside together, boots sinking into the crusted snow. Caleb led Jerry along the path to the small shed at the edge of the property, where stacks of split wood were neatly arranged. Every log was measured, every piece accounted for. In most households, a winter like this meant throwing everything in haphazardly, fires going cold before the day was done. In Caleb's system, wood was precious, its energy maximized. "You really think the neighbors will try it?" Jerry asked, glancing at the horizon, where distant shapes of other cabins dotted the snow-covered valley. Caleb shrugged. "Some will, some never will, doesn't matter. They'll see the difference soon enough. When they step inside here and feel the warmth, that's all the proof they need." The first real test came that afternoon. A storm front pushed over the ridge, wind cutting through the trees with a ferocity that rattled the cabin's exterior. Snow whipped across the fields in sharp, white arcs, and the temperature dropped quickly. Jerry and Caleb watched from the porch as flakes piled on the roof, sliding in small avalanches down the sides. "This is it," Caleb said quietly. "If the cabin holds now, we'll know it's not luck, it's design." Inside, the Octagon felt like a sanctuary. Heat radiated from the central hearth evenly, touching every wall, every floorboard, every piece of furniture. The angles forced air circulation in a continuous loop, carrying warmth from the fire to the farthest corners without stagnation. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the cabin maintained a steady, comforting temperature. By mid-afternoon, the first neighbors arrived, drawn by curiosity and the promise of shelter from the storm. There was Martha Keene, a woman whose small farm sat a mile down the road, and her 2 grandchildren, their cheeks red from the cold. There was Thomas Hargrove, a grizzled man who had spent decades hauling firewood in every condition imaginable. And finally, a few of the younger men, skeptical but unable to resist the pull of fascination. They shuffled inside cautiously, brushing snow from coats, eyes wide as they took in the cabin's unusual shape. Caleb stepped aside, letting them explore, explaining only when asked. "It's warm," Thomas said after a long silence, voice gruff with surprise. "Like not just near the fire, everywhere. I don't get it." Caleb nodded. "That's the point. Half the wood you'd normally burn would do the same here. The shape, the airflow, the loft above, everything is designed to work together. Nothing is wasted and nothing escapes." Martha knelt to pull her children close, their small hands brushing against the smooth walls. "It's incredible," she whispered. "I thought we'd be freezing tonight, but it's cozy, really cozy." The storm raged outside, but inside, the cabin felt alive with warmth and quiet satisfaction. Jerry watched from the corner, still half in disbelief, half in awe. "I can't believe it," he muttered. "Every winter we've wasted so much wood, and all it took was thinking differently." Caleb's jaw tightened, eyes scanning the faces of the neighbors. He could see the mixture of frustration, curiosity, and hope that winter always brought. This storm would be a crucible, a test not just of the cabin, but of their patience and understanding. He felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. If this failed, everyone would freeze and ridicule would return, harsher than ever. But if it held, it would be a quiet revolution. As evening fell, the storm escalated. Winds whipped across the valley, bending trees, sending snow drift skittering across the fields. The cabin flexed slightly under the pressure, its beams groaning in protest but holding firm. Caleb moved methodically through each corner, checking joints, adjusting shutters, feeding the fire just enough to maintain steady heat. The neighbors watched in tense silence, some daring to touch the walls to feel the warmth radiate. Every gust against the exterior was a test, and every maintained temperature inside was a small victory. Children huddled near the fire, their eyes wide with fascination, the adults, skepticism slowly giving way to wonder. By nightfall, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled like a living creature, pressing against the cabin with relentless force. Caleb stood in the center, hands on his hips, breathing steadily, listening to every creak and groan. The Octagon held. The fire maintained its warmth. The wood, precious and carefully rationed, burned efficiently, radiating maximum energy with minimum waste. Outside, Jerry muttered under his breath, almost to himself. I can't believe it's holding. Half the wood, the whole place, it's warm. Martha's children danced around the hearth, laughing, their cheeks flushed with heat instead of cold. It's like magic, one whispered. Caleb shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not magic, he said softly, just understanding, observation. Patience and a little stubbornness. The neighbors lingered, some murmuring to each other, others silently studying the angles of the walls, the placement of the hearth, the clever loft above. For the first time, they saw winter not as an unstoppable adversary, but as a challenge that could be met with ingenuity and careful thought. When the storm finally began to ease, the night sky opened slightly, revealing faint stars above the still snow-covered valley. Inside the cabin, warmth lingered, steady and comforting, a tangible victory against the bitter cold. Caleb allowed himself a quiet exhale, chest rising and falling with relief and satisfaction. "You've changed the way we see things, Cal," Jerry said, voice low, reverent. I don't know if anyone will admit it yet, but this is something else." Caleb only nodded, gazing at the fire. He didn't need validation. The cabin had proven itself, the neighbors had felt it, and the winter, no matter how cruel, had been denied its usual triumph. Outside, the valley lay silent under the frost, the wind reduced to a whisper. Inside, the Octagon glowed with life and warmth, a small fortress of ingenuity and resilience. Caleb stood near the hearth, watching the neighbors interact, laughter mixing with awe, feeling the quiet pride of a man who had built not just a cabin, but a lesson, a way to survive, to thrive, and to redefine what was possible against the relentless cold. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more storms, more gusts of wind and snow. But tonight, the cabin stood, the fire burned, and the neighbors understood, if only a little, that there was another way to fight winter. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the valley like a weight. Snow had fallen in the night, thick and silent, covering every tree, fence, and field in a blanket so uniform it made the world feel unreal. Caleb stood at the loft window, boots dusted with powdery snow, tracing the tracks that led to the cabin's front door. Most of the neighbors were already awake, bundled tightly, their footsteps tentative as they tested the crusted snow. Jerry was the first to arrive at the porch, scarf wrapped twice around his neck, hood pulled low. His breath came out in short, visible bursts. "Caleb, it's worse than last night," he said, voice tense. "The wind's coming off the ridge. It's not just cold, it's vicious." Caleb nodded, pulling on his heavy coat. "I know. That's why we need to test the cabin today, really test it, see if it can handle the worst the storm can throw at us." They stepped outside together, crunching over the icy snow. Caleb's eyes scanned the horizon, reading the subtle shifts in clouds, the angle of drifting flurries, the first jagged gusts beginning to push across the fields. He pointed toward the ridge. "There, that's where the storm is strongest. Watch how it hits the valley, that's our crucible." By mid-morning, the first real onslaught began. Wind and snow tore across the valley, rattling the Octagon cabin's exterior, pushing snow up against the walls in icy drifts. The neighbors clustered near the porch, some clutching tools, others simply bracing against the cold, watching Caleb move with precise determination. Inside, the cabin felt alive. The Octagon design forced air to circulate in a continuous loop, feeding warmth from the central hearth to every corner, every wall, every floorboard. The loft above acted like a heat reservoir, keeping the rising warmth from escaping and forcing it downward. The difference between this cabin and the neighboring homes was staggering. "Step inside," Caleb called to Jerry. The neighbor hesitated but obeyed, brushing snow from his sleeves before crossing the threshold. The instant difference hit him like a wave. Every nerve in his body relaxed as the warmth enveloped him. He glanced at the walls, the angles, the fire. I can't. It's insane. Half the wood and it's perfect." The storm intensified. Snow whipped against the windows, a jagged blur of white that cut visibility to nearly nothing. Outside, the gusts hit the cabin like hammers, shaking the shingles, bending the small overhangs, rattling the doors. Caleb moved methodically, checking the integrity of the structure, adjusting shutters, feeding the fire just enough to maintain consistent heat. One sudden gust hit the cabin with brutal force, slamming against the roof at an odd angle. The octagon's walls flexed slightly, the loft vibrating as the pressure shifted. Caleb's heart raced. If the structure failed now, everything would plummet in temperature within minutes, and the neighbors, already reliant on his ingenuity, would freeze. "Hold," he shouted, hammering at a reinforcing brace near the central beam. Sweat mixed with frost on his brow as he adjusted the angle to absorb the impact. The cabin groaned under the force, the wood flexing, but the structure did not give. From outside, Jerry and Martha watched, eyes wide with awe and fear. It's holding," Jerry shouted, voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "Barely, but holding." Martha clutched her children close, whispering reassurances while their wide eyes followed every movement of Caleb's precise, almost frantic motions. The storm was relentless, each gust a challenge to the cabin's integrity, each vibration a test of Caleb's careful calculations. Minutes passed like hours. Each gust hammered, each creak and groan echoed through the octagon. Caleb moved like a man possessed, adjusting, reinforcing, feeding the fire just enough to sustain the warmth, his every motion calculated but desperate. He could feel the pulse of the cabin beneath his hands, reading every subtle vibration, every minor flex of wood and metal. Then a second, even stronger gust struck, hitting the roof with a sharp, jagged force. Snow and ice battered the exterior, pressing against the walls with crushing weight. Caleb leapt, bracing himself, hammering at the central supports, adjusting braces, guiding energy through the structure rather than resisting it. Every instinct screamed to retreat to let the cold claim victory. But he didn't. Inside, the warmth remained, defying the storm. Children huddled in blankets, watching, their small voices whispering in nervous excitement. Adults pressed against the walls, feeling the heat circulate, sensing the difference between Caleb's design and the haphazard efforts in other homes. Jerry's voice broke the tense silence. I don't know how to explain it," he said. "We've had storms worse than this and nothing, but here it's holding and it's warm." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the roof, on the shifting snow, on the slight give of a shingle under pressure. The octagon was proving its worth, but the storm was far from finished. Another gust ripped across the ridge, slamming into the structure with brutal force. Caleb gritted his teeth, muscles tense, adjusting the braces just in time. The cabin shuddered, the loft vibrating, but the walls held. Outside, the neighbors could only watch in stunned silence. They had come expecting a quaint experiment, maybe a clever oddity, but now they were witnessing a crucible of human ingenuity against elemental fury. Each survival moment was punctuated by the roar of the wind, the crunch of snow, the subtle creaks of the cabin as it flexed but refused to break. Finally, the storm seemed to reach its limit. The wind's fury gradually eased, snow still drifted, but the pressure against the cabin's walls began to lessen. Caleb stood in the center, chest heaving, fingers numb but steady. He allowed himself a quick glance at the neighbors, faces pale, eyes wide, awe and relief mingling in equal measure. "It worked," Jerry said finally, voice hoarse. "It really worked. The cabin held, the heat stayed inside." Martha knelt beside her children, eyes shining with tears. "We were so scared," she said quietly, "but he knew exactly what to do." Caleb nodded, exhaustion and triumph warring across his face. He sank onto a bench near the hearth, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The octagon had survived its trial, proving that careful design, observation, and a willingness to think differently could defeat even the most brutal winter storms. Hours later, as the storm receded into a mere whisper, the neighbors began to relax. They moved cautiously around the cabin, touching walls, feeling the even warmth, marveling at the efficiency of the hearth and the clever circulation of air. Children laughed softly, running along the interior angles, while adults whispered excitedly about how they might replicate aspects of Caleb's design. Caleb watched quietly, allowing the moment to sink in. He knew more storms would come. Winter would test him again. But tonight, he had proven something essential, not just about a cabin, not just about wood and heat, but about human ingenuity and perseverance. By evening, the valley fell silent under a blanket of fresh snow, the world muted and still. The octagon glowed from within, a beacon of warmth, resilience, and triumph. Caleb stepped outside, feeling the cold bite against his face, but the satisfaction in his chest outweighed any discomfort. The storm had come, and he had prevailed. And somewhere deep in the valley, as the wind whispered softly through the skeletal trees, a lesson was etched into the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Sometimes, the most unconventional solutions, the ones others doubt the most, are the ones that survive the harshest tests and leave the deepest impact. The morning after the storm was calm, almost unnervingly so. A soft gray light filtered through the cloud cover, casting long, muted shadows across the snow-covered valley. Every branch, fence post, and roofline wore a delicate frost, glistening faintly, a fragile reminder of the night's chaos. Caleb stepped onto the porch of his Octagon cabin, boots crunching lightly against the hard-packed snow, inhaling the sharp, clean winter air. The wind had relented, leaving only a whisper among the pines, as though the storm itself were paying respect to what had survived. From the road below, he could see the neighbors emerging cautiously, bundled in layers of wool and heavy coats, eyes squinting against the pale light. Jerry approached first, hat tipped low, snowflakes clinging to his scarf. He waved a gloved hand, and Caleb returned it with a nod. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a recognition forged in the crucible of a shared trial. "Morning, Caleb," Jerry called, voice hoarse from yesterday's wind. We owe you more than we know." Caleb shook his head, brushing snow from his shoulders. "No, Jerry, you just need to see it for yourselves. That's what matters." The neighbors clustered around the cabin, children trailing behind, curiosity bright in their flushed faces. Martha and her grandchildren lingered near the porch, the little one's wide eyes scanning the Octagon with wonder. It's warm," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's warm everywhere, even in the corners I thought would be freezing." Caleb smiled faintly. "That's the Octagon," he said simply. "No corners for cold to hide in. Every wall works together and the heat circulates naturally. It's just physics and patience." The neighbors stepped inside, one by one brushing snow from coats and boots. The difference hit them immediately. Even with gusts still whispering outside, the cabin held a gentle, steady warmth. It was subtle at first, the kind of heat that didn't hit you in a single wave, but instead filled every nerve, every muscle, every shadowed corner. The children ran along the walls, laughing, testing each angle, delighted by the even distribution of warmth. Jerry moved closer to Caleb, lowering his voice. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. I mean, we've had winters worse than this, and no one has ever done it like you. You might have changed the way we all think about heating our homes." Caleb looked around at the gathered faces, neighbors, friends, families, and felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. Not the kind of pride that shouted or demanded recognition, but the deep, steady satisfaction that comes from knowing something you built with care, insight, and a willingness to challenge convention has made a real difference. "Maybe," he said finally, "but this isn't just about me. This is about thinking differently, noticing details others miss, and trusting your own observations. That's what got us through last night." The neighbors nodded, some smiling, others shaking their heads in quiet amazement. Outside, the sun began to break through the clouds, casting a pale golden glow over the snow. It glinted off the roof of the Octagon, highlighting the precise angles, the careful joinery, and the simple elegance of a design born not from aesthetics, but from necessity and insight. Children pointed to the rafters, to the loft above, their small voices full of excitement. "It's like magic," one exclaimed, eyes wide. "The whole house is warm." Caleb chuckled, shaking his head. "Not magic," he said. "Just understanding how things work. Heat rises, air moves, walls redirect it. You just need to listen." As the morning progressed, neighbors began to talk in earnest, asking questions, taking notes, examining the Octagon from every angle. Some whispered about trying similar designs in their own homes. Others simply stood back, marveling silently at what had been accomplished. There was a sense of collective inspiration, a spark of curiosity that lingered even after the threat of the storm had passed. By noon, the valley felt transformed. The fear and anxiety that had gripped everyone during the storm had given way to relief, awe, and a quiet, resilient pride. Families shared warm drinks, laughter began to echo across the snow, and the children played in the soft, crusted drifts, their cheeks red with cold but hearts warmed by the shelter that Caleb's Octagon had provided. Jerry approached Caleb once more, hand extended. "Thank you," he said simply, "for more than just warmth, for showing us that sometimes the way we've always done things isn't the only way." Caleb shook his hand firmly. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "Every eye watching, every hand helping, even just asking questions, that all mattered. You all helped make this lesson stick." As the sun climbed higher, Caleb took a moment to step back, looking at the Octagon from the edge of the clearing. The angles caught the light perfectly, the snow drifted neatly around its base, and the smoke from the hearth curled into the sky like a promise. The neighbors moved in the distance, checking on their own homes, discussing plans, and quietly reassessing the strategies they had always taken for granted. There was a subtle energy in the air, a sense that Valley had shifted, that people had learned something fundamental about resilience, ingenuity, and the courage to trust unconventional ideas. The storm had been a test, but the victory was more than survival. It was a reminder that careful observation, bold action, and persistence could turn even the harshest elements into allies. As evening approached, Caleb stepped inside the Octagon once more, letting the warmth from the hearth seep into his bones. The storm was over, the air outside calm, and yet the lesson remained. The world was full of forces beyond control, but there was power in understanding, in adaptation, and in courage. He moved through the cabin slowly, checking each angle, each wall, each corner, satisfied that the heat flowed evenly, that every calculation had held true under extreme pressure. The neighbors' voices carried faintly from outside, laughter and chatter mixing with the occasional bark of a dog or the crunch of boots in snow. Life had resumed, different now, enriched by the proof that innovation, when paired with courage, could withstand the harshest trials. Finally, Caleb stood at the loft window, looking out across the valley. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows, and the snow shimmered with the soft glow of late afternoon light. The Octagon stood proud, a quiet monument to ingenuity and perseverance. Inside, the warmth was steady, comforting, and absolute. A smile touched Caleb's lips. It had been a long, grueling battle against nature, against doubt, and against convention. But tonight, for the first time in memory, he could feel something rare and profound, complete, unwavering satisfaction. The Octagon had done its job, the neighbors had learned, and the valley had endured. He turned back to the hearth, watching the fire flicker, listening to the quiet settling of the cabin around him. The storm would come again someday, of that he was certain. But now he knew with unwavering clarity that the lessons learned here, the courage to think differently, the meticulous attention to detail, the refusal to accept the obvious as the only path, would endure long after the winds had subsided and the snow had melted. Caleb Hale, standing at the center of his Octagon, felt the warmth not just in his body but in his soul. The neighbors had mocked him, doubted him, and yet in the face of nature's fury he had been proven right. And in that quiet, unwavering victory, he understood something deeper. Sometimes the smallest innovations, the most unconventional ideas, could change lives in ways that were as enduring as they were invisible, like warmth in the midst of a Minnesota winter. And somewhere in the stillness, as night fell over the valley and stars began to glimmer faintly above, Caleb smiled, knowing that the Octagon's heat would endure, just as the courage to think differently would endure too. The storm had passed, the cabin had held, and for the first time in years, everyone inside felt an unshakable sense of triumph, of hope, and of belonging. The Octagon, simple yet revolutionary, had done more than conserve wood or trap heat. It had shown a way forward, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the quiet power of daring to do things differently when everyone else laughs. And in that warm, flickering glow, Caleb finally allowed himself to rest, confident that the lessons of the storm, the triumph of design, and the magic of perseverance would linger far longer than the snow ever could. The story ends with warmth, community admiration, and a lasting emotional impact, showing the full arc from skepticism to triumph.